My name is Donnie Underwood. This is my informative speech, and I'm going to be choosing a topic of the history of basketball. So basketball first started in the 1890s. It started whenever James Naismith, who was a physical education teacher at the college, which is now located in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's a physical education teacher, and in the winter months, they didn't have any sports to do outside that compared to football or rugby, which were popular in the time. And during the winter months, they wanted to find something that they could do indoors that was fun and that was competitive like those sports. So that's when James Naismith came up with basketball, which originally the first goal was a bushel, was one of these, what they would put peas in. And he just got one of those and he hung it up, and they used a volleyball, and that was the very first form of basketball and how it was invented. So it was a very simple game at first. Really, all you would do is you get the volleyball and just find a way to get it into the goal, and then you use a ladder to climb up and get the ball out, and then they would just restart. And usually the games would go to 1 to 2 points. It's a very simple, very basic game, and over time it evolves to the game that we know today. So after James Naismith invented it, it later became popular at YMCA's, and that's where it really began to spread as Army and military servicemen took it overseas as well. It became popular over there. But really it started to where it is today. It all started in college and universities. The very first college and university game was played, and the score got to 10 points. That was as high as it gets now today. The scores get up to 100 to 150 points. But it started in colleges, started in universities, and that's really where it began to blow up from there. It began to blow up in college, and from there, leagues were established. The first pro games began to play, and the very first leagues, which were known as the NBL, were very small leagues, and they were just played for small lump sums of money, and that's where pro basketball began, as well as it began to grow overseas as well in small pro leagues, until a couple of leagues in the United States began to come together and form one big league now that we know as the NBA. The NBA is the staple for basketball. The National Basketball Association is still currently around today. It started in the 1960s, and it still is strong, but it all began in the 60s. And in the 60s, the game was a lot different than it was today. In the 1960s, there was no three-point line, which is a line on the court that represents if you shoot the ball from that current spot, you get 3 points. Everything else within that line is 2 points. At the beginning of the sport, it was not like that. The majority of points were scored within 0 to 5 feet of the basket. So the game was dominated by larger men. Perhaps the most notorious one that you may have heard of, his name was Bill Russell. He won 11 rings with the Boston Celtics, and he was very dominant because he was more athletic and larger, and it led to there being a dynasty, which was very common in the early NBA, which was the dynasty of the Celtics. From there, we see the game begin to evolve over time. Players like Clyde Drexler, like Dr. J, which are some more people who would score really close to the basket, who were just very athletic men who could get it in. But however, the game starts to evolve more within the 70s, within the 80s, as we see big name players like Larry Bird and like Magic Johnson and a rivalry that they had, and the game began to be more mainstream because of television, and the NBA games were now being on cable TV and readily accessible to people in the comfort of their homes. So the NBA really began to blow up in popularity there because people wanted to see the rivalry. Hey, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson are playing. We have to get to it. We have to watch the game tonight. And that really began to increase ratings. And then we get to the 90s. The 90s is perhaps one of the most notorious eras because of one very special person. In every sport, there's a quote-unquote GOAT, the greatest of all times. And the 90s was the era of the GOAT of basketball, known as Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Michael Jordan, he's a staple in current culture today still. He's known as the greatest of all time, and he began his reign for 6 years. He won 6 championships with the Chicago Bulls. And in that time, we see that basketball begins to explode because everybody wants to see Michael Jordan. They want to see him do what he does best and dominate players, and that's what he did against great competition. And then in the 2000s, we see the game begin to evolve more to current culture, to players like Allen Iverson bringing hip-hop into basketball, bringing in the culture of the outside world into basketball, and we see great players like him and Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal. And then we get more to current basketball today. Current basketball today is a lot different because of players like Stephen Curry. It's a lot more oriented around the outside of far away from the basket. Whereas I said before, basketball earlier was played within, close to the basket. Now basketball is mainly oriented as far away as the basket as the 30 to 35 feet, as people can shoot the basketball so well. The game has evolved a lot since the beginning. And if you would stick a current player from today's NBA into the very early NBA, he would absolutely dominate because of over time the game has evolved. So today's game is a lot more three-point oriented, a lot more foul oriented, which is basically it's a lot more of a technical game. So it's really evolved. But at the beginning, it all started with a man named James Naismith who worked at a college who all he had was a bushel, just a bucket that they'd stick peas in, and from there he started the very first basketball game, and it led all the way to the current NBA today, which is very influential in our culture, especially here in the United States, and even spreading every single day overseas in Europe and in Asia and all those other countries. It continues to grow. It's the third most popular sport in America right now, and perhaps it can get to number 2 or number 1 in the future. That's my presentation.